Hello, it's me. It's environmental science time, and I'm here to give the next lecture. It's Thursday, and everybody's been working on that exam 3, which I think I set to be due this evening. And the numbers have been showing up, so that's great. And I'll let you know how those numbers work out once I can look at them all together. I've had a few students because I've contacted them and said, you need to get this done. They said, oh, well, I didn't realize that was there. You should understand that when we started this semester, it was 3 lectures a week and a lab each week. And then at the end of a certain number of weeks, there was an exam. Right now, it's 3 lectures a week and a lab. And at the end of a certain number of weeks, there's an exam. That's how I'm continuing. That's what I've been asked to do. And it's not always fun sitting here in my office, but that's what I'm trying to keep up so that we can say you did everything that was necessary to get complete credit for this class. All right? So here we are. And we just got through the section of the course that was about resources, and now we're going to look a little bit more at about some environmental messes that people create. Not just using stuff up, but adding stuff to the environment that we really didn't want there. And so we're going to be talking about something called pollutants. Just getting my my pen ready here. And underneath pollutants, it says air, water, soil, ... That means there's a lot of other places where pollutants can be present. Pollutant is a kind of an odd thing to define. What you think might be a pollutant might not, and what you think might not be a pollutant could be. I've written a definition here. It says matter or energy in the wrong place or concentration. So you might look at something and say, oh, that looks ugly, or oh, that smells bad, or oh, that tastes terrible. And you might think, oh, there might be some pollution in it. Sometimes those are really natural patterns and they're not dangerous to anyone at all. And then there might be other things that you can't sense at all. So we really have to be careful what we call pollution or toxicity, because we have to do some science on it to make sure that that's an appropriate term for that. I got a list here. Pollutants can be chemicals, they can be organisms, microorganisms that are released in the environment, they can be solid trash that we leave lying around. Litter is a form of pollution. They can be heat, they can be light, they can be sound. Sometimes all the lights shining in the city at night are considered light pollution. And then I also put another ... because you could add to this list. I'm quite certain of it. This is a horrible picture in the background there, with some nasty solid waste and some smog and smoke and things. I'm not even really sure what it is, but it doesn't look like fun at all. Anyway, this lecture is going to be about the concept of pollution and toxicity and human health in general. And then we're going to move forward to talk specifically about air pollution, and then about water pollution, and then about solid waste as we move through this material. So this is kind of just about the definition of pollution and toxicity. Okay, so our first stop in talking about toxicity was to reinforce the concept that I just mentioned, and that is that pollution or toxicity depends on the context and the concentration of whatever the material is that we're concerned about. And this is just an attempt to illustrate that. This is a news story about a woman who drank too much water. She drank too much water, and that was to the point that it became toxic to her. That's possible. So water, which is not something we think of as being a pollutant or a toxic material, can be toxic in the right amount. And that's called, let's see, I think it's called water intoxication or hydrotoxicity. And it is possible, not that it's something you need to be aware or concerned about, but it's something that helps to illustrate the idea that, as I said before, any matter or energy can be a pollutant. It depends on the context and the concentration. All right? It's not a very good picture of this news story, but I felt it illustrated the point. So what I mean when I say the context of the pollutant is kind of how the exposure occurs. Is it all at once? Is it a little at a time? Where is the exposure on the body? Where is it in the environment? What was being done during the exposure? Is it because of breathing? Is it because of eating, drinking? Is it because of touching? Lots of things that can be sorted out, which make something more or less toxic. But what we're starting with here is not the context, but the concentration. So if those are the two things, context and concentration, here's where we are with the concentration. The first thing I want you to know is that measuring concentration of a toxin or a pollutant is not always easy. And sometimes we just have to make our best guess and our best estimate. But we have a concept that we often use as the foundation for describing this concentration, and it is ppm, or parts per million. That is really generic. That could be, and I've listed some here, it could be micrograms per milliliter in a solution of water. It could be milligrams per liter in a solution of water, milligrams per kilogram in a powder, pounds per acre. There's lots of ways of thinking about what parts per million is, because we're not putting any units on that, so it's messy. But that is the standard approach that the EPA takes, the Environmental Protection Agency here in the United States, and everything kind of tries to be translatable into that. So what I've got here is that ppm, parts per million, is a unitless indicator of very low concentration, parts per million. Okay, for every million parts, there's one part that's the toxic material. Used by the EPA and other regulatory agencies, and then there's some examples here that I went through. Also, down below, a table which has some elements that we'll pull right off of the periodic table and show what the normal concentrations for these elements are in the environment. Of course, we're not actually giving a specific context there. They could be different concentrations in the soil than they are in the water than they are in the air. So I'm not really sure what the context is we're looking at here. But there's normal concentrations, and then there's toxic concentrations. They're in the same units. They're in milligrams per kilogram. So a milligram is a thousandth of a gram. And a kilogram is 1,000 grams. So we're 1,000 below the gram point and 1,000 above the gram point. And when we multiply those together, that's a million. So this is parts per million. 3 to 15 milligrams per kilogram of copper, that's what Cu is, okay? So the first one here is copper. 3 to 15 milligrams per kilogram is what we would normally see in the environment. The toxic concentration isn't much more than that. It's 20 milligrams per kilogram. So we don't have to increase the amount of copper in the environment very much in order to make it toxic. And all of these give a little bit more clarity on these particular elements. You might actually look at some of those elements, like for instance, here's iron, and you might think, you know, iron's a good thing. I'm always being told to get more iron in my diet, so I need to get more of that. Well, that's not a good thing in all contexts and in all concentrations. It can be toxic. So 50 to 250 milligrams per kilogram is normal. More than 500 is too much. And so just so you know, just because something is good for us in some context doesn't mean it's not toxic in other. So this is a good kind of example. This is copper, nickel, lead, mercury, chromium, manganese, zinc, molybdenum, cobalt, iron, arsenic, SB. I might have to look that one up. Anyway, just some examples of elements and where they become toxic for us. Okay, so that was kind of a little introduction to concentrations and toxicity. We're going to come back to that. I just wanted to say this is something that's really important, and I'm taking a step back now and looking at the big picture of pollution in terms of being a whole process. Pollution is released, and then it is maybe changed in the environment, and then it ends up in a context where it might become toxic or dangerous, and then there's contact, and there's the health issues that happen. So I found a little diagram here that I think helps illustrate this as a process and not just a material. We have sources of pollutants, and then it goes through a process here of being released and being chemically transformed, and that includes reacting with the air, reacting with the water, reacting with the sunlight, having some impact of the weather, and after being moved around and changed, it ends up coming in contact with people. And this is environmental science, so it's not just about the environment, it's about the people in that environment. So impacts on people and the environment. So that we see this over the course here, we have emission, formation, dispersion, and concentration. Okay, so I've made a list over here that just helps bring attention to some of the different ways that these mechanisms of this process might be distinguished if we want to think about what are the most dangerous moments or contacts that might happen in this process. First of all, I've made a list of types of pollution, and we like to divide pollutions up into organic pollutants versus inorganic pollutants. Organic pollutants have those carbon-to-carbon bonds in them, and we are organic beings. All life is organic, and so something that is organic is going to have a different interaction with living systems than something that is inorganic. I'm not saying that it's more dangerous or less dangerous. It just follows a different set of rules. And so one of the things that agencies want to know right away is this an organic toxin or is it an inorganic toxin? Okay, so those elements I just showed you, those were all inorganic, but something like if you spilled some oil on the ground or into a pond, that's an organic material that's being introduced there that would be an organic pollutant. The next is, so that was organic, inorganic. The next is primary versus secondary pollutants. I've got a slide that illustrates that, but basically primary pollutants are ones that are released into the environment and they are immediately toxic. Secondary pollutants are ones that something is released into the environment and then it is impacted by the environment because of the sunlight, because of the weather. That changes it and it makes it toxic. So that's a kind of a slightly different distinction there. And then finally we have something on here that is molecular versus particulate. Molecular means something is in its chemical form, dissolved in the water, in molecular form, drifting in the air, whereas particulate means that these are things like smoke particles and pollen grains and mold spores that are not molecules but tiny little objects floating through the air or drifting through the water. And when we come in contact with them, they can produce toxic effects. So that's an important distinction. Let's see. The next part of my list is sources of pollutants, and I'm not going to say too much about these except to appreciate the diversity of those sources, and that's what we're looking at down here. Natural sources, some things that can be toxic are just produced by organisms in nature. Pollen grains or mold spores are a good example, but there are actually also chemicals that are produced by living systems or released from geologic material. So there's natural sources, there's industrial sources, because we tend to be making money with the things we manufacture, and that sometimes releases toxins. There's residential pollution that we create around our house and at the curb and wherever we're trying to get rid of our waste. There's transportation pollution. That's the one we're always talking about, is the emissions from our cars and from our planes, and so that's something that we have to look at as being a primary type of pollutant that we have a concern about. And then there's also agricultural. We've talked about fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides and the kinds of chemicals that get spread around. And then if we're going to be making farmlands, we're also cutting down trees, which is one of the ways that we get some of these toxins out of the environment. So we're eliminating the filtration system that is often useful for us in order to grow food that we obviously need. So some good sources there. The next step in my list is the dispersion. And I told you we're going to be going through some different mechanisms of dispersion: air pollution, water pollution, solid waste. I've got one here that I haven't mentioned yet, and that's bioaccumulation. There are some materials that when they come in contact with organisms, those organisms will take them in and then keep them. Okay, they are usually organic molecules that are lipid soluble, and so they end up in the fats in the lipids in an organism, and they just stay there and they won't be eliminated. So the organism itself becomes toxic. And then when something eats it, the organism that ate it then becomes toxic. And if it keeps eating over time, it gets more and more and more toxic. And then something bigger eats that and becomes more and more and more toxic. So through the food chain, some toxins can accumulate so that larger predatory organisms are then getting more and more dangerous, more and more at risk, and more dangerous. That's called bioaccumulation. That's a little bit different by just drifting around in the air or the water or sitting in a landfill somewhere. So we have to consider that. One last thing here, the impacts of pollution. We need to know what the impacts on humans are, what kinds of health issues are coming up, things that we might call diseases. We've also been introduced to the idea that some organic pollutions change the nature of the ecosystem in an aquatic system where it actually increases the primary production to the point where the ecosystem collapses. We learned about that in the last section. We called that eutrophication, where we get green slime growing all over the surface of water. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to water pollution also. And then whatever environmental damage might happen. If the soil gets contaminated and so we can't grow plants there, if the air gets contaminated and so populations of organisms are moving out, or the water gets contaminated so insects can't reproduce or something along those lines, there's actual damage that's done so that the ecosystem is going to be impacted. So this list is a way of appreciating the complexity of this process, and we often miss those points when we say this is where the pollution is coming from and these are the health issues that are happening. We often miss some of the process that goes into making those health issues occur. Okay, a little bit more detail about a couple of these things, not all of them, but a couple. This is a slide about pollution sources, and we have an important distinction that happens here. We often look at a pollutant and we say, is this a point source pollutant or a non-point source pollutant? And the difference makes all the difference in terms of the way that we deal with it. I've got a couple pictures here that are both considered point source pollutants. So a point source pollutant says that there is a single source that can be identified. We say it is a discrete location or a facility. So you say something smells funny or tastes funny or looks funny, and look, there's the source of it. We can actually see it, and that makes it easier to deal with because you can say, look, who is releasing this stuff through this pipe? Who is releasing this stuff through this smokestack? We need to hold that organization, that person, that source accountable. So it's easier to deal with in terms of regulations. A non-point source pollutant is diffuse and widespread from lots and lots and lots of smaller sources. Very difficult to trace, sometimes easy to trace, but even though it's easy to trace, very difficult to regulate. The exhaust coming out of your car is a non-point source pollutant. Now you might say, look, I can see the exhaust coming out of my car. That's a point source. Yeah, but everybody's doing it to a tiny little extent, and so it's building up in the atmosphere in a way that is a non-point source pollutant. So that's just a good example of that. The way that we deal with these in terms of regulations and in terms of monitoring and measuring, very different. So those are important concepts in terms of defining those. Okay, here's another couple of definitions that I mentioned before. Sometimes toxins are released into the environment and they are immediately toxic, and sometimes they are altered by the environment and become toxic or become more toxic. And these are referred to as primary pollutants, which have direct impacts, and secondary pollutants, which are produced by reactions. This is a big cloud of primary pollutants: carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, ammonia, nitrogen dioxide. These are actually toxic. They just get changed into a different set of pollutants by the environment. And that is indicated over here in another cloud, which seems to be associated with the sun and the air shining on it. And so we find some new things like ozone and ammonium and hydrogen peroxide, which are also toxic, but now toxic in a different way because they've been changed. So primary pollutants versus secondary pollutants. And we're going to have to track both of those through this process. Okay, now here I've got another couple of definitions. I always like it when these definitions are in pairs because to me it makes it easier to learn something when you're immediately distinguishing one version of it from another version of it. It makes it easier to remember those terms. Anyway, this is jumping from the source side of things to the exposure side of things. These are about exposures to dangerous or toxic or health risk materials. And we have two words here that are important. There is acute exposure and there is chronic exposure. The acute exposure has nothing to do with being cute. It is actually the more extreme of these two, although it doesn't necessarily have a worse impact. When exposure to a toxin is immediate and extreme, so you're coming in contact with a lot of it all at once, drinking a poison or swimming in toxic water or breathing in a whole bunch of something that's dangerous during one period of time. Discrete, again, it is a distinguishable event. It happened here and then. It's kind of like that point source pollutant, in the sense that, well, if you came in contact very closely with a point source of one of those types of toxins, it would be an acute exposure. The next one is chronic exposure, and this is repeated smaller exposure over longer periods of time. Very difficult to trace and or regulate, just like the non-point source pollution. So I have a little cartoony version of these here, and we see, I don't know, one person being exposed very quickly to a bucket full of something that's toxic, and they immediately fall on the ground. I don't know what's happened to them, but they've had a negative health impact of that. Down below, we have a number of people that are all getting small amounts of whatever this toxic material is, and then eventually one of them gets enough of it so that they're falling on the ground, and whatever is happening to them there is also happening. So the outcome is not necessarily better with chronic exposure, because sometimes it's a little bit more invisible and a little bit harder to see. But we need to be able to understand what that exposure is like in order to figure out how to create regulations to combat it. So this is kind of a cool schematic diagram that I found that kind of brings together a few of the things that I was just talking about. This is a town, and there's let's see, there's a factory, and there's people living here, and there's roads, and there's a lake or a pond, and there's a farm, and there's some fishing going on. Wow, all the different types of resources that we've been looking at. And there's arrows everywhere, and there's little labels everywhere, which says that there's all kinds of opportunities for toxins or pollutants to be released into the environment. Then they're changed by the environment, by the weather, by the sun, by the rain, and brought back into contact with the people or the organisms that live in this area. They might have been changed. It's a complicated process, and so we see all these big arrows and little arrows and things moving around. And the conclusion that I draw from this are toxins are everywhere. We can't just say, oh, they're everywhere, so there's nothing we can do about them. We need to know where they are toxic. So we have to go throughout all of these different compartments of this picture, of this environment, and be taking little samples everywhere and say, are these things toxic here? Are they toxic here? Are they toxic at this particular time of year? Are they toxic at this particular time of year? So we might be looking for evidence of pollution with tests that are done all over these communities that we live in. And clearly we have a lot of government help with this, but also we have a lot of advisories and like all the shelter at home stuff we're going through right now. This is advice from scientists who are concerned with a toxic material, which is this virus. Anyway, the next thing I want to talk about is how we go about figuring how toxic something is, and then having a mechanism of measuring it in lots of different places to see where is it most toxic, where should we be most concerned about it. So this is the way we go about this, and let me tell you that this is not rocket science. It's not complicated. We basically take living organisms. Those can be plants, it can be animals, they might even be fungus. So we take living organisms, expose them to toxins, and count how many of them die. That's not the finest form of science I've ever heard of, but in many ways it's very effective because of the fact that we can choose organisms that are targeting the kind of environmental impact that we're concerned about. So this is called a lethal dose or an LD50 test. LD stands for lethal dose. LD50 means how much do we have to give these organisms in order for half of them to die. So basically we collect some organisms and we expose them in the context and in the concentrations that we have a concern about, and we wait to see what context and what concentration produces a 50% mortality rate. That's what we're looking at here. This is called the dose response curve. So we start with a very low dose, 0, no exposure. Well, if we have 0 exposure, then none of our organisms are going to die. As we increase the exposure, we increase the mortality rate until it becomes so toxic that mortality is 100%. What we really want is to define this spot right here. So we're just going to measure this at a bunch of different concentrations and count the dead organisms and say, if we just draw a curve that fits those points, we want that inflection point, that point that says this is where 50% of our organisms will die or will have died if we had actually done that concentration. Now we do this with lots of different types of organisms. I have some examples here. These are some lab mice and they look very cute, but they are the standard for testing mammals. Why do we want to test a mammal? Why do we want to test a vertebrate with a backbone and a hair, something like us? Because we're concerned about the impact of this toxic material on us. So the closer we get to us, the more believable the results of this research are going to be. So lab mice, and they're using these for cosmetics, for kitchen products, for toxins in the water, in the atmosphere. It's a very common approach to this type of science. Next, down below here, I have something called some brine shrimp. If you read comic books when you were a kid, you might have known these as sea monkeys because they used to advertise these in the back of the comic books. Anyway, they're really cheap and they're really easy to take care of. You grow a whole bunch of them at once. You're probably more concerned about the mice than you are about the sea monkeys. If we have a water toxin and we want to see what impact that might have on invertebrates in the water, then these brine shrimp are a good way to do this type of test. We also have some different types of fish that we use. So here's the sea monkeys and here's some fish and here's some crickets. Basically, any type of organism that you would buy for bait or to feed your pet. Sometimes these live crickets, live fish, live brine shrimp, sometimes those are used to feed your fish. If you're going to be able to grow a lot of them really quickly, they're going to be a good candidate for doing this type of test. Like I said, not rocket science, but it has been very, very useful in terms of figuring out how far we're willing to go when it comes to increasing these concentrations of toxins. Here are some results from some LD50 tests so that you can get a sense of them. And I did some really basic math up above here. It's not really, again, it's not rocket science, and we're just doing some basic multiplying and dividing to try to figure out how to apply the results from these tests to people and to make some rules that will help us use these tests. So what we have here is some toxic materials, some of which are really toxic. These are the ones at the top, super toxic in very small doses, and some of them a lot less toxic. And I mentioned water as being a not very toxic material, but can be toxic if you drank too much of it. And so this gives us an indication of how much of that we could come in contact with or ingest per body weight, and think about the results of these LD50 tests. So what we do is we do the test, and the first thing that we have to do if we want to apply it to humans, maybe it's not humans we're concerned about, maybe we're interested in the fish in a pond or something, so we don't need to worry about that. But if we're interested in humans, then we need to multiply up by a body mass conversion. So if a mouse has 1/1000th of the weight of a human, then we have to multiply up to 1,000 because the LD50 for humans would be 1,000 times more, because it is remember, parts per million milligrams of toxin relative to kilograms of body weight. Okay, so this botulinum toxin, which is the nastiness that we get botulism from, which for some reason people have taken to injecting in their face to get rid of wrinkles. Botox, that's what they call that. Anyway, so what we have here is a very, very low concentration of that can be very dangerous. And so you want to avoid that if you can. Apparently getting it injected doesn't cause that kind of harm, but I don't really need to do that anyway. If as we move down the table here, we end up seeing things like water and vitamin C, and clearly we can ingest a lot more of those and not expect them to be toxic. So that's the LD50. Just multiplying out by the body weight is the LD50. But that's a little bit extreme to say that, oh, well, here's what it would take to kill 50% of the people who came in contact with it. Well, that's not really a number we're interested in. What we want to do is divide that by 10, and that gives us something called a low dose toxicity. That's not going to kill 50% of the people. It's maybe going to kill, 3% of the people, something like that. Then we're going to divide it by 10 again, and we get what's called the safe dose toxicity. Maybe it's going to make people sick. Maybe we don't expect to see any mortality in this. Then we're going to divide by 10 one more time, and we call that the non-toxic level. These are some pretty simple rule of thumb approaches, but you don't want to mess around with these. And so we're trying to be conservative by divide by 10, divide by 10, divide by 10. So we're just moving that decimal place 3 points to say this is what we're comfortable with. And I think that to show what's toxic to 50% of the mice that they come in contact with, and then to multiply that by body weight and then divide it basically by 1,000, I think is a pretty conservative approach, and that's the way that we've been going about this. So, like I told you before, we visited concentrations, and I told you we would go into a little bit more detail about the concentrations, and that's what I've done here with the LD50 tests. The next thing I want to do is run down through some examples of toxic materials that we might be looking for in the environment and what their impacts are. And the first step in that process is to look at two major groups of things that we might be looking for, and those are toxins, which are chemicals that cause harmful effects, and then pathogens, which are microorganisms, living things that cause harmful effects. Now, you might not think about microorganisms as pollution, but we have a big concern about medical waste and what we do with that when things come out of a hospital or out of a doctor's office. We have concerns about things like this coronavirus traveling in the air in airplanes or in people that are traveling around the world. They fit the definition of pollutants very nicely. It's just that they function in different ways, so we have a different concept that's associated with them. So toxins are chemicals, pathogens are microorganisms. And I have some examples here. I'm going to go through all of these separate examples of the toxins. Neurotoxins act on the nervous system. Carcinogens damage DNA, and they cause cancer to develop, because that is a problem where the DNA of a cell gets damaged so that it doesn't know when to stop dividing, and so we get a whole bunch of cells that just keep dividing, and that's what we call a tumor. We have teratogens, which actually disrupt. They don't damage the DNA, but they disrupt the regulation of DNA. And DNA is an instruction book that basically tells us how to build a new organism. And if you disrupt that instruction book, the organism doesn't get built properly. So teratogens cause birth defects. Allergens are the things that cause allergies, and they act on our immune system. And endocrine disruptors mess up our hormonal communication within our bodies. They act on the endocrine system. And so with these different types of chemicals all have different impacts. Under pathogens, I have some examples, although I'm not going to really go through these. Bacteria, protists, insects, these might all be considered pollutants under the right conditions. Molds, mold spores, and also viruses, even though they're not alive. Remember we learned that? Viruses aren't alive, which really irritates me when I hear all these people on the news saying that COVID-19 can live on a surface for a certain amount of time. You need to be a smarty pants science person. And when you hear that, you say, they were never alive to begin with. They are infective for a certain amount of time. It's not that they're alive, that they are actually capable of infecting for that time. So there you go. Anyway, so I'm going to go through the toxins and then I'm going to be done. I don't have a lot more details to say about the pathogens. So this is my first kind of toxin. This is called neurotoxins. Meet the neurotoxins. And neurotoxins, just like it says in the name, are toxins that have an influence on neurons, which are nerve cells. Nerve cells are the ones that are sending signals all throughout our bodies. And so anything that does damage to those cells has the potential to cause brain damage because the brain is a big bundle of neurons. So that's a problem. Things that cause brain damage we tend to want to avoid. Some of them seem kind of hard to avoid here. Look, we've got a can that we might drink out of that has some manganese in it. We have fluoride that we put into our toothpaste on purpose, which is a neurotoxin. I'm not trying to create any conspiracy theories. I'm just trying to say that some of the things we come in contact with all the time, when they get to high enough concentrations or frequent enough exposure, if you brushed your teeth 6 hours a day, you might be coming in contact with enough fluoride to have that be a neurotoxin. So these are just some examples. You might have heard of lead paint or lead in the water causing brain damage. That's a neurotoxin. Mercury causes brain damage. Some of the things, look, alcohol causes brain damage in high enough concentrations. Anyway, lots of good examples there. And one example that's focused on in a little bit more detail here is a map that shows us where a material called glyphosate is being used. This is an herbicide that kills plants, and we just finished talking about spraying of toxic materials in agricultural systems. This is what we call Roundup. That's the industrial name for it, and we're spraying it on farm fields all over the place because it doesn't have an impact on the wheats and the corns and the grasses that we grow. It only has an impact on the weeds that grow around them. So you can just spray it all over the place and not worry about it killing the crops. But we might have to worry about it killing us. This is a map that shows where that chemical is being used all over the country, and basically it's a map of where we're doing agricultural work and where people are using this in residential areas. It is a neurotoxin, so that's something that we need to be concerned about. So my next type of toxin is a carcinogen, which is a chemical or a particulate or an organism that actually causes damage to DNA. It causes mutations to occur to DNA. This could be energy, it could be radiation, it could be even sound in some cases. By creating damage to DNA, it often takes that DNA instruction book, which tells a cell how to do all its functions, and scrambles it a little bit so that the cell doesn't know, for instance, when to stop or to start doing certain functions. And so what happens with cancer, and this is what carcinogens cause, is that the cell loses its ability to stop dividing. The cell just keeps dividing. It divides and then it makes two cells, which are both confused about when to stop. So they're both dividing. Now we have 4, and now we have 8, and now we have 16, and now we have 32. None of them know when to stop dividing, so we're creating a big bundle of cells where they just keep dividing, and that's what we call a tumor. Also, it happens in blood cells, which is what we call leukemia. These are all forms of cancer, and there's lots of different things that cause them. It's not a thing that we're not going to discover the cure for cancer, because not all cells work the same way and not all carcinogens work the same way. So, but we're always getting insight into that. I've got a little cartoony diagram here that shows a normal cell and a normal cell growth, and then there's some damage to the DNA in one cell, and all it takes is one cell, and then that divides into 2 and 4 and 8, and all of those have the same damage, because when a cell divides, all the DNA gets copied. I'm Sorry if I didn't make that clear. So that's why a tumor grows, because all of those cells in a tumor are copies of the original one. I also have on the left here a list of the classifications that the EPA uses for carcinogenic materials. And for some reason, they divided them into 4 different groups, but then they split group 2 into 2 levels because it wasn't refined enough. And I like the language that they use here, probably even more than the numbers. We have group 4 is probably not carcinogenic. Remember that at certain concentrations, anything can be dangerous, but probably not carcinogenic. Group 3 is carcinogenically, we don't really know. It's confusing. So there's things there like tea and magnetic fields and fluorescent light, things that we come in contact with all the time, but they're not really testable. Then we get to the group 2, and we have possibly carcinogenic and probably carcinogenic. 2 very distinct words, possibly and probably. So I'm not really sure exactly how those are sorted out, but I'm a big coffee drinker, so it concerns me that coffee is in that list there. Gasoline fumes, fertilizers, exhaust, anyway, and then we move up to emissions from high temperature frying, steroids, exposures working in hairdressing, red meat, some possibilities, and we might want to sort those out. I also should note that ecotoxicologists and oncologists always like to make jokes about this group of possibly carcinogenic materials because they're always saying, is it to be or not to be? It's like a Shakespeare joke. Anyway, I'm just going to step away from that. The last one is group 1, and that is definitely demonstrated carcinogenic to humans. And I just want to point out, smoking, getting sunlight, alcoholic beverages, and I think that's a picture of bacon, which makes me very sad. Anyway, that's a processed meat. So those things are all proven carcinogenic. Take them all in low amounts. Wear sunscreen, stop smoking, don't drink too much alcohol and bacon. Okay. Here's my next type of toxic chemicals. These are called teratogens. And teratogens disrupt not necessarily the DNA, but the process that regulates the DNA. There's all kinds of genes that tell the genes when to do the gene-like things. And so the steps involved are pretty important in the development of an organism as it starts from a fertilized egg and grows into an adult. So teratogens disrupt that developmental process, which the most obvious impact of is what we call birth defects. So the example here that I have of a teratogen that is very infamous because of the problems it's caused is something called thalidomide, which was a chemical that was given to women in the 60s. This is an example of an advertisement that was selling thalidomide. It's an example of a chemical that was given to pregnant women in the 60s to help with morning sickness. And so this stuff was called Mornidine, to help you with morning sickness so that you could get up and cook breakfast. Okay, there's problems with that, but not the chemical problems. The chemical problems were that this chemical that was developed actually to do lots of things, to fight stress, to bring down blood pressure. It was a chemical that was being used in a lot of medications. But the fact that it was being used among pregnant women meant that as a teratogen, it had the capability of causing lots of birth defects. And so people my age, because this was in the 60s and I was a kid in the 60s, kids that were born in the 60s, there was a higher likelihood of them having limb defects. That seemed to be the place where this expressed itself the most. And so there's a picture here. I was drawn to this picture of this kid pounding little pegs in a board with his feet because I had that same toy when I was a kid, and so it just kind of resonates with me. But he was born with no arms, and so there were a bunch of kids at this time. As a result of this thalidomide toxin that were born with limb defects like that. Anyway, down below we also see that radiation is a teratogen, that taking drugs is a teratogen, and that drinking alcohol is a teratogen. You may have heard of fetal alcohol syndrome. These should be avoided when, in fact, you're pregnant, or among lots of other things that should be avoided when you're pregnant. Anyway, all teratogens, and the one that this makes me think of the most is the recommendation that the FDA makes about tuna fish. Pregnant women should not eat tuna fish, even just canned tuna fish. They should not eat tuna fish more than once a week. So if you are a tuna fish lover, you shouldn't go beyond that once a week, because tuna is a large predatory organism from the ocean. It eats lots of other smaller organisms, and so it has some potential for bioaccumulation. Some toxins end up accumulating in tuna to the point that you wouldn't want to have chronic exposure to them. One of them is mercury, and mercury is a teratogen and can cause birth defects, so pregnant women should avoid eating too much tuna. Anyway, just another example there. Okay, so this is my next type of toxic material, and these are called endocrine disruptors. And I would say that if there's a toxic material that's been in the news and of interest to people just recently all over the world, it's the endocrine disruptors. This is just my language. I'm saying that these chemicals confuse the glandular systems in the body, or the hormone systems in the body. They confuse them because they're big, complicated organic molecules that have pieces that look like the hormones that are normally active in the body. And as a result, they get involved in a process of regulating the body at a time when they shouldn't, or in a way that they shouldn't. And so they do things like result in infertility or developmental delays or obesity. Anything that is regulated by glands can be influenced by these chemicals. So we have a bunch of different examples here, and these are, let's see, flame retardants, things, a fire extinguisher, the phthalates that are in plastics, like plastic bottles. You might have heard of BPA being really a chemical of concern in plastic bottles. We've got pesticides, we've got dioxins, which are in paper and lots of industrial processes. We even have phytoestrogens, which are chemicals that we collect from plants that look like human estrogen, and as a result, they mess up the reproductive system of organisms that use estrogen, which of course includes women. And so we use phytoestrogens in birth control pills, which might sound like a great thing, and clearly that's evidence that they are endocrine disruptors. But at the same time, everybody who's taking birth control pills and maybe some other drugs that have these endocrine disruptors in them, they're then peeing those chemicals out and flushing them down the toilet, and if they don't get cleaned up, then they end up in the river. And so there's the potential for them to end up in other types of situations which might be environmentally damaging. So these endocrine disruptors are pretty hot topic right now, and we seem to be concerned about regulating them. My personal favorite endocrine disruptor is a chemical called tributyl tin, which is, we used to put a lot of it on the hulls of boats because it prevents fouling organisms like barnacles and sea squirts from growing on the bottom of a boat because it's toxic. But it is an endocrine disruptor, and in harbors where a lot of boats were docked and this tributyl tin was on the bottom of the hull, it would leach out onto the bottom, and you'd find that there were snails, little invertebrates, little snails and things that lived on the bottom in the harbor. There would be female snails that were doing strange things like growing penises because their endocrine systems had been disrupted by a chemical that looked a lot like the chemical that normally regulated that system. So it's a big concern, especially if you're a snail, but obviously to humans as well. Okay, last type of toxic chemical, and this is allergens. Allergens cause hyperimmune response. That means the immune system overreacts to the presence of a foreign substance. anybody who has asthma, who gets rashes, who gets migraines, and there are also some hyperimmune response diseases that people get exposed to. Anybody who has bad allergies is familiar with this particular concern. I've got a picture here of what's called an allergy test, which is basically where they put different substances, kind of like the LD50, just kind of exposing organisms to something and seeing what happens. But in this case, it's a tiny amount, and they stick little pins in the skin to see what kind of reaction they get. We got like a crazy rash developing in all these little circles. Every circle has a number on it so that you can expose somebody to all kinds of different things and see, oh, what are they likely allergic to? Allergies are a big issue right now. Peanuts and seafood and things like that. Mold allergies, pollen allergies. But there are also industrial things that cause allergies, and things that are connected to agriculture or to domesticated animals that also get released. Things that are connected to industry. We have chemicals involved in fabrics. We have feathers from chicken farms or something like that. We have pollen. We have molds. These are all things that end up in, and even medications and cleaning solutions. These end up being released into the environment in concentrations that are high enough to cause people to have these terrible responses. So we need to be aware of where these things are and at what concentration do they start to produce these responses in people who have these allergies. We can't just ask people with allergies to go around totally wigged out all the time because they're constantly taking antihistamines or something. We have to deal with these pollutions at the source. And this is my last slide, and I went through all the different types of toxins, and remember there was a group of toxins and a group of pathogens, and since we're in the middle of sheltering at home from COVID-19, I thought I would show this horrific looking picture of people not practicing social distancing very well. Pathogens are disease-causing organisms, including viruses, even though those are not organisms. That's a little pet peeve of mine, remember. And these result in what we call infections, which of course the body is often capable of fighting, but we also have medicines that help us with that. I just want to let you know that these things are treated like particulate toxins, that we're concerned with, touching surfaces and washing our hands and not touching our faces, because those are the same ways we would be concerned about toxic chemicals that were around us, except that in this case, pathogens are capable of reproducing. So one or two particles might cause the infection and then spread throughout the body. So you might even have to be a little bit more careful about these pathogens than you are with acute exposure to toxic materials. So it's just kind of throwing this in at the end. Anyway, that's it. That's what I have to say. This says here that I took about 50 minutes, which is not too bad. This is the only lecture I'm doing for today, and I'm also going to put up a little activity to do as a lab, because Thursday is supposed to be our one lecture and a lab day, and I'm trying to stick to my rhythm. So that's 2 lectures on Tuesday, a lecture and a lab on Thursday. I hope everybody's safe. I wish you the best, and when I get the results back from the exam, I'll put up an explanation so that you can understand how it fits in with the rest of your planning for the semester. After I get it back, I might say a couple things about grades, because I know there's been this thing that went out about pass, fail. I don't know if that's a good idea for most students. It seems like it's only a good idea for a very small group of students, like ones that normally get really super grades and for some reason aren't doing that well in a class. But if they're doing really bad, then they wouldn't want to do that, because that would cause them to fail the class. If they're getting a C and they're not happy with a C, then they might want to do the pass-fail, because that wouldn't affect their GPA. But honestly, if their GPA is in the A's and B's, it's not a big deal anyway. So I don't know how well this functions, but I'm happy to talk to any of you about what kind of strategy might work best for you. I'm not your advisor, but I understand where science fits in with a lot of different careers. Anyway, hope you're well. Hope your family is well. I missed you guys, and maybe at some point we could get together and have one of these go-to meetings or Zoom meetings just to say hi and maybe tie some loose ends together for the course. That's not a bad idea. I'll make an announcement if I decide that that's something that I'd like to make possible. Take care. Bye.